Commander Zorath stood on the bridge of his warship and looked at the planet below him with cold eyes that showed nothing but contempt for the small blue and gold world spinning slowly in the darkness of space. The Velthari Dominion had spent 3 long cycles watching this world, and every report had come back the same way, telling him that this was nothing more than a simple farming colony filled with humans who grew food and lived quiet lives far away from the great wars that burned across the galaxy. "Show me the latest surveillance data," he commanded, and his intelligence officer quickly brought up the holographic display that filled the center of the bridge with images of golden fields stretching as far as any eye could see. 60,000 humans lived on this world they called New Kansas, and they had spread themselves across a single continent where they built simple homes made of wood and stone and metal that looked almost primitive. Compared to the gleaming cities of the Dominion, there were no orbital defense platforms hanging in space to protect them, no military bases hidden in the mountains, no shield generators humming with power beneath the soil, and not even a single warship to guard their skies. "They are farmers," the intelligence officer said, with a slight laugh in his voice that he did not bother to hide. "And nothing more than farmers who grow grain and raise animals and send their harvests to feed other human worlds." Zorath let a thin smile cross his face as he studied the peaceful images of humans working in their fields, driving simple machines through rows of golden wheat, and gathering together in small towns where children played in the streets without any fear of what lurked among the stars. The war between the Velthari Dominion and the Terran Alliance had been going badly for his people in recent months, and the High Command had grown desperate for a victory that would lift the spirits of their citizens and show the galaxy that the Dominion was still a force to be feared. This world, called New Kansas, was exactly what they needed. A soft target that would fall quickly and provide them with 60,000 human prisoners, who could be used as leverage in the negotiations that would eventually come. "Prepare the invasion fleet," Zorath commanded, and around him his officers moved with excitement in their steps because they all believed this would be an easy conquest that would bring them glory and advancement. In the ranks of the Dominion military, 40 warships gathered in formation above New Kansas, their hulls gleaming with the purple light of Velthari technology, their weapons charged and ready to rain destruction down on anyone foolish enough to resist. 200,000 soldiers waited in the transport ships, each one wearing the crystalline power armor that made Velthari warriors feared across 100 worlds, each one carrying weapons that could cut through steel and stone with beams of focused energy. They had conquered dozens of worlds with forces smaller than this, and every officer in the fleet believed that New Kansas would surrender within hours of their landing. What none of them understood, what none of them could possibly have known, was that humans had been farming for more than 10,000 years on their homeworld called Earth. 10,000 years of learning patience, of watching seasons change and waiting for the right moment to plant and the right moment to harvest. 10,000 years of dealing with pests and predators and learning that sometimes the best way to deal with a threat was not to chase it, but to let it come to you. Governor Ellen Marsh stood on the porch of her farmhouse and watched the alien fleet appear in the sky, like a dark cloud that blotted out the sun. And she felt no fear in her heart because she had been waiting for this day since she was a little girl learning to work the soil beside her grandmother. Her grandmother had told her stories about Earth, about the ancient farmers who had built civilizations and fed empires and outlasted every army that had ever tried to take their land by force. The soldiers always think they are strong because they have weapons, her grandmother had said with a knowing smile. But the farmer is stronger because the farmer knows how to wait. Ellen tapped the communication device in her ear, and spoke in a calm voice that carried across every farm and every homestead on the planet. "They are here," she said simply. "Begin the sowing." Across New Kansas, farmers stopped their work in the fields and began moving toward their homes, walking calmly through the rows of grain without any sign of panic or fear. The Valkyrie, watching from orbit, saw this movement and interpreted it as the reaction of frightened civilians running to hide from the coming storm. And they laughed among themselves at how easy this conquest would be. General Varric commanded the ground forces, and he was a veteran of many campaigns who had crushed human resistance on 3 other worlds and expected this one to be no different from the others. His soldiers landed in perfect formations across the Golden Plains, their transport ships settling into the soft soil as ramps lowered, and thousands of armored warriors marched out into the alien sunshine. The air smelled sweet with the scent of growing things, and Varric found himself almost enjoying the pleasant weather as he established his command post in the middle of a vast wheat field. "The humans are retreating to their population centers," one of his officers reported, "and we detect no military response of any kind." Varric nodded with satisfaction because this was exactly what he had expected from a world of simple farmers who had never known war and had no idea how to fight against a real army. He gave the order to advance, and his 200,000 soldiers began marching toward the human settlements, their boots crushing the golden wheat beneath them as they moved in disciplined columns across the peaceful landscape. None of them noticed anything strange about the soil they walked upon. None of them felt the slight vibration beneath their feet as something ancient and patient began to wake. The humans had been preparing this world for 3 generations, engineering the very earth itself with technology so subtle and so deeply hidden that no scanner could detect it. Dormant machines smaller than grains of sand waited in every field, in every road, in every patch of ground where an invader might set foot. And now they were finally receiving the signal they had been programmed to respond to. Ellen Marsh watched the alien army advance from the window of her farmhouse, and she allowed herself a small smile as she saw them walking deeper and deeper into the trap that her people had spent decades building. "Welcome to New Kansas," she whispered to herself as the sun began to set on the first day of the harvest. "And may you find exactly what you came looking for." General Varric watched his army spread across the golden fields of New Kansas like a great purple wave washing over a beach, and he felt the satisfaction of a commander who knew that victory was already within his grasp. His soldiers moved with the precision that came from years of training and dozens of successful campaigns, establishing 4 bases at regular intervals and securing landing zones for the supply ships that would soon follow. The crystalline power armor they wore hummed with energy, enhancing their strength and speed, and protecting them from any weapon the primitive humans might try to use against them. "All units report ready," his communications officer announced, and Varric nodded as he studied the holographic map that showed the positions of every soldier under his command. The human settlements were scattered across the continent like seeds thrown carelessly by the wind. Small towns and isolated farmhouses that would offer no meaningful resistance to his overwhelming force. He gave the order to begin the advance toward the nearest population center, a town called Millbrook that his scouts reported contained approximately 3,000 humans who had locked themselves inside their homes. "They hide like frightened animals," one of his officers said with amusement, "and they will surrender the moment they see our strength." The first column of soldiers began marching through the wheat fields, their boots leaving trails of crushed grain behind them as they moved in perfect formation toward their objective. Private Keth was young and eager, and filled with dreams of glory as he marched alongside his fellow soldiers, his weapon held ready even though he did not expect to use it against farmers who had never known battle. He was thinking about the medals he would earn and the stories he would tell when he returned home when something strange happened to his armor. The humming sound that he had grown so accustomed to began to fade, growing quieter and quieter until it stopped completely and left him in sudden silence. His weapon, which should have glowed with the blue light of a charged energy cell, went dark in his hands. What is happening? He tried to say through his communication system, but no sound came out because the communicator had died along with everything else all around him. Other soldiers were stopping in confusion as their armor and weapons failed at the same time, leaving them standing like statues in the middle of the golden field. General Varric received the first reports of equipment failure with disbelief, certain that there must be some mistake or some localized malfunction that his technicians could quickly repair. But the reports kept coming from every unit across the entire continent, all telling the same impossible story of armor going dead and weapons refusing to fire and vehicles stopping in their tracks as if their power had simply vanished. This cannot be, he said as he watched his own command display flicker and die, leaving him blind and unable to communicate with his forces. The answer lay in the soil beneath their feet, in the billions of tiny machines that human engineers had spent 3 generations perfecting and spreading across every inch of New Kansas. These machines fed on the nitrogen in the soil and produced a compound that was completely harmless to living things, but absolutely devastating to the crystalline neural networks that controlled all Veltri technology. Every piece of equipment that touched the ground absorbed these nanomachines through microscopic cracks and joints, and once inside they spread like a disease that could not be stopped or cured. The Veltri soldiers found themselves trapped inside armor that had become nothing more than heavy shells of dead crystal, unable to move freely or remove the protective suits that had suddenly become prisons. Their weapons were useless metal and crystal that would not fire no matter how many times they pressed the triggers. Their vehicles sat motionless in the fields, their engines silent and their systems completely unresponsive. Even their landing craft had been infected, the nanomachines spreading through every system until nothing remained that could lift them back to the safety of the fleet in orbit. Commander Zorath watched from his warship with growing horror as he realized that his entire invasion force had been neutralized without a single shot being fired. Send rescue shuttles, he ordered. But his officers reported that any shuttle that landed would suffer the same fate as the transports already on the surface. His army was trapped on a hostile world with no weapons, no armor, no vehicles, and no way to escape. And now the humans began to emerge from their homes. Ellen Marsh walked out onto her porch and looked across the fields where thousands of Veltri soldiers stood frozen in their dead armor, struggling to move and failing to understand what had happened to them. She picked up an old hunting rifle that had belonged to her grandfather, a simple weapon that used chemical propellant to fire metal projectiles, technology so primitive that the Veltri had never even considered it a threat all across New Kansas. Other farmers were doing the same thing, taking out weapons that had been passed down through generations and maintained with loving care for exactly this moment. They also brought out tools that had been designed for working the land but could serve other purposes when the need arose. Pitchforks with sharp metal tines that could pierce the gaps in dead armor sides, with curved blades that could cut through the flexible joints between crystalline plates, axes and hammers, and heavy chains that could batter and break and bind. The humans moved out into the fields in groups, approaching the helpless Veltri soldiers with the calm efficiency of farmers beginning a long day of work. "What are they doing?" General Varric managed to say through his frozen helmet as he watched the humans coming closer with their primitive weapons gleaming in the sunlight. A human woman stopped in front of him and looked up at his towering armored form with eyes that held no fear. Only the patient determination of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this day. "We are farmers," Ellen Marsh said to the general, with a smile that made his blood run cold. "And you are standing in our field at harvest time." She turned to the other humans who had gathered around her and raised her voice so that everyone could hear. "Remember what your parents and grandparents taught you," she called out across the golden plains. "Work carefully, work together, and do not let a single one escape." The harvest had begun. General Vorak had conquered 5 worlds in his long military career, and he had always believed that victory belonged to those with superior technology and overwhelming force. Now he stood trapped in armor that refused to move, surrounded by humans carrying farming tools. And he finally began to understand that he had made a terrible mistake. His 200,000 soldiers were scattered across the continent in the same helpless condition, unable to fight or flee or even call for help from the fleet that watched uselessly from orbit. The humans moved among them like shepherds walking through a flock, calm and organized and showing no fear of the armored giants who towered over them. How is this possible? Vorak demanded as a group of farmers approached his position with ropes and chains that they clearly intended to use on him. Ellen Marsh walked at the front of the group, her hunting rifle slung over her shoulder and her eyes bright with a fierce joy that came from seeing years of preparation finally bearing fruit. "Your people spent 3 cycles watching us from space," she said to the general as her companions began wrapping chains around his immobilized legs. "And all you saw were farmers growing food." She gestured to the fields around them, to the golden wheat that stretched to the horizon in every direction. "You never asked yourself why we grew so much," she continued, "or why we spread the same crops across every inch of land instead of varying what we planted like any sensible farmer would do." The answer was simple but brilliant in its conception. The wheat was not just food but camouflage, hiding the true nature of the soil beneath it from any scanner or surveillance device. Every field on New Kansas looked exactly the same from orbit. Endless rows of golden grain that revealed nothing about the trap, waiting beneath the surface. "We have been preparing for you since before I was born," Ellen told the general as her people finished binding him and began the process of cutting away his dead armor piece by piece. "My grandmother helped design the nanomachines that are eating your technology right now, and she spent her whole life making sure they would be ready when the enemy finally came." Across the planet, similar scenes were playing out as the humans of New Kansas began the methodical work of neutralizing and capturing the helpless Valkyrie army. The farmers used their knowledge of the land to maximum advantage, herding groups of soldiers toward natural barriers and prepare positions where they could be contained, and controlled irrigation channels that had seemed like simple water management systems became moats and obstacles that the struggling Valkyrie could not cross. Grain silos that had appeared to be nothing more than storage buildings revealed hidden doors and tunnels that connected to a vast underground network spanning the entire continent. The humans moved through these tunnels like blood through veins, appearing suddenly to surround isolated groups of soldiers and then vanishing again before any resistance could be organized. Young Thomas Reed was 16 years old and had been training for this day since he learned to walk, practicing the skills his father and mother had taught him until they became as natural as breathing. Carried a crossbow that his grandfather had made by hand, a weapon that used no electronics and could not be disabled by any technology. And he moved through the wheat fields with the silent grace of a predator stalking prey. His target was a Valkyrie officer who had managed to partially free himself from his dead armor and was trying to rally a group of soldiers near a broken transport ship. Thomas waited in the wheat until the officer turned away from him, then rose smoothly and fired a bolt that struck the alien in the gap between his shoulder plates. The officer fell with a cry of pain and surprise, and the soldiers around him froze in terror as they realized they could not even see where the attack had come from. "Surrender," Thomas called out as he fitted another bolt to his crossbow, "and we will treat your wounds and give you food and water." The soldiers looked at each other and then at their fallen commander, and made the only choice that made sense for creatures who had no weapons and no way to fight back. They raised their hands in the universal gesture of surrender, and Thomas felt a surge of pride as he called for the adults to come and take charge of the prisoners. Similar victories were happening all across New Kansas as the humans systematically worked their way through the scattered Veltri forces. The combines and tractors that had been used to work the fields were converted into weapons of war, their heavy frames and powerful engines making them perfect for breaking through groups of soldiers who tried to form defensive positions. Livestock that had seemed like simple farm animals revealed training that no one had expected, with dogs herding groups of prisoners like sheep, and horses carrying riders who coordinated the efforts of hundreds of farmers across miles of earth territory. Governor Marsh monitored everything from her command center beneath the old barn where her great-grandparents had first settled when they came to New Kansas 3 generations ago. The walls were covered with screens showing feeds from cameras hidden throughout the planet, and the air hummed with the chatter of communication systems that the Veltri had never detected because they used technology so old and so simple that it did not register on any modern scanner. Southern Sector reports all enemy units contained, one of her aides announced, and Ellen marked another section of her map as secured. Western forces are meeting some resistance near the mountain pass, another aide reported, but reinforcements are on the way and should have the situation under control within the hour. Ellen nodded and allowed herself a moment to appreciate what her people were accomplishing. 60,000 farmers were defeating an army of 200,000 professional soldiers, and they were doing it not with superior firepower, but with superior planning and patience and knowledge of the land they called home. "This is what happens when you underestimate farmers," she said quietly to herself as she watched another group of Veltri soldiers surrender on one of her screens. "We may be simple people who work the soil and grow food, but we have been doing this for 10,000 years. And we have learned lessons that no army can forget." The sun was setting on the second day of the harvest, and the work was going even better than anyone had dared to hope. Commander Zorith had not slept in 3 days, and the weight of his failure pressed down on him like a physical force that made it hard to breathe, or think or do anything except stare at the planet below and watch his army being systematically destroyed. His 40 warships hung in orbit like useless decorations, their weapons capable of reducing entire cities to ash, but completely unable to help the soldiers trapped on the surface. "We could bombard the planet," one of his officers suggested in a voice that carried no real conviction. "Destroy the humans and everything they have built." Zorith shook his head because he knew that such an action would accomplish nothing except killing his own soldiers along with the enemy. The humans had spread their prisoners across every settlement and every farm, making it impossible to target them without causing massive casualties among the Veltri forces. It was a simple but effective strategy that showed the humans understood exactly what they were doing. "They are hurting us," Zorith said with bitter admiration as he watched another group of his soldiers being led away in chains on one of the surveillance feeds, like animals being driven to slaughter on the surface. The harvest continued with ruthless efficiency. General Vorik had been stripped of his armor and placed in a cage made of wood and metal, a primitive prison that he could not escape because his captors had bound his hands and feet with simple rope that his weakened body could not break. He watched through the bars as humans walked past carrying bundles of weapons and equipment that they had taken from his soldiers, sorting through the alien technology with curious eyes and quick hands that seemed to understand exactly what they were looking at. A young human girl stopped in front of his cage and studied him with the fearless curiosity of a child examining an interesting insect. "My grandmother said you would come," she told him in a matter-of-fact voice that held no anger or hatred. "And she said we would be ready when you did." "Your grandmother must have been a soldier," Vorik replied, trying to understand how simple farmers could have planned and executed such a perfect trap. The girl laughed and shook her head. "She was a farmer," she said with obvious pride, "just like everyone else on this world. And she taught me that the most important thing a farmer can do is prepare for the future." She walked away before Vorik could ask any more questions, leaving him alone with his shame and his confusion across the continent. The last pockets of resistance were being eliminated one by one. A group of Velthari soldiers had managed to reach a rocky outcropping where the nanomachines in the soil could not affect them, and they had used the high ground to hold off the farmers for almost a full day. But the humans were patient, and they knew that the soldiers had no food or water and would eventually have to come down or die of thirst on the morning of the third day. The soldiers emerged with their hands raised, and the farmers accepted their surrender with the same calm efficiency they had shown throughout the entire campaign. Another group had tried to make a run for one of the landing craft, hoping that they could somehow repair the damage and escape to orbit. They were stopped by a single old man with a hunting dog and a shotgun who had been waiting for exactly this possibility. "You cannot fix what? The land is broken," the old man told them as they surrendered. "And you cannot escape a trap that has been 3 generations in the making." Governor Marsh received the reports of each capture with a growing sense of satisfaction, marking the locations on her map and watching as the last red dots representing enemy forces turned to green one by one. Her aide informed her that they had taken 180,000 prisoners so far, with another 15,000 confirmed dead and the remaining 5,000 expected to surrender before nightfall. The casualties among her own people had been remarkably light. Fewer than 200 dead and perhaps 1,000 wounded, most of them from accidents rather than enemy action. "It is almost over," she said to the officers gathered around her in the command center. "But we still have one more task to complete before we can call this harvest finished." She pointed to a location on the map where a single shuttle remained partially functional, protected from the nanomachines by a landing pad made of materials that the tiny machines could not penetrate. General Vorik had ordered them construction of this pad as a precaution, never imagining that it would become the last hope for the surviving Velthari commanders to escape the trap. "They will try to reach that shuttle," Ellen said, "and we need to make sure they do not succeed." She assigned her best hunters to the task, young men and women who had spent their lives learning to track animals through the wilderness and could follow any trail no matter how faint. Sarah Chung was 17 years old and the best archer on the planet, a title she had earned by winning every competition. Since she was 12 years old, her grandfather had given her his bow on his deathbed, a weapon he had carried from Earth and used to hunt game in the wild places that still existed on humanity's homeworld. "I want you to lead the team," Governor Marsh told her, "and I want you to make sure that General Vorik does not leave this planet until we are ready to let him go." Sarah nodded and gathered her hunters, and they set out toward the shuttle with the quiet confidence of predators who knew their territory better than any prey could ever hope to learn it. The Velthari commanders never had a chance. They were spotted the moment they left their hiding place, tracked through every field and forest they crossed, and surrounded before they came within sight of the shuttle that represented their only hope of escape. Sarah stepped out of the wheat directly in front of General Vorik and raised her bow with an arrow already fitted to the string. "This belonged to my grandfather," she told him as she aimed at his chest, "and he taught me to use it before I could read or write." Vorik looked at the primitive weapon and the young human holding it, and he felt something he had never experienced. In his long military career, he felt respect for an enemy who had beaten him not with superior technology, but with patience and preparation and an unshakable connection to the land they called home. "I surrender," he said, and the words tasted bitter on his tongue but also strangely freeing. The harvest was complete. The galaxy watched what had happened on New Kansas with a mixture of disbelief and growing fear. And the news spread from world to world like fire moving through dry grass. 200,000 Velthari soldiers, the largest ground force the Dominion had assembled in more than a decade, had been captured by farmers using tools and weapons that most civilizations had abandoned thousands of years ago. 40 warships remained trapped in orbit, their crews running low on supplies and unable to land or flee, held hostage by a planet that had revealed itself to be far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The Terran Alliance released a simple message to every news network in known space, a single paragraph that carried more weight than any weapon. "The colonists of New Kansas have successfully defended their homesteads against an unprovoked invasion by the Velthari Dominion, and we invite the Dominion to negotiate the safe return of their personnel at their earliest convenience in the halls of power across a dozen species." Military commanders and political leaders gathered to discuss what this victory meant for the balance of power in the galaxy. The Velthari had always been seen as one of the great military powers. Their crystalline technology and disciplined armies capable of overwhelming any opponent through sheer force. Now they had been humiliated by farmers, defeated not through superior firepower, but through planning that had begun before most of their soldiers were even born. "The humans are more dangerous than we understood," the Cathari ambassador said during an emergency session of the Galactic Council, "and we must reconsider our assessments of their capabilities." Other representatives nodded in agreement, their eyes carrying a new wariness when they looked at the human delegates sitting calmly across the chamber. Humans had seeded worlds like New Kansas throughout contested space, planets that looked weak and inviting to potential conquerors, but were actually elaborate traps waiting to be sprung. No one knew how many of these trap worlds existed, or where they might be hidden. And that uncertainty was perhaps the greatest weapon the humans had gained from their victory on New Kansas itself. The work of rebuilding had already begun. The fields that had been trampled by the invasion were being replanted. The soil turned and prepared for the next season of growth with the same patient care that had characterized everything the colonists did. Governor Ellen Marsh walked through one of these fields on a warm morning 3 weeks after the last Velthari soldier had surrendered, her boots leaving prints in the soft earth as she inspected the progress of the work. The Velthari prisoners had been organized into labor crews and were helping with the reconstruction, their strength and numbers making short work of tasks that would have taken the humans much longer to complete on their own. General Vorik worked alongside his soldiers, stripped of his rank and armor, but treated with a dignity that surprised him given what his people had tried to do to this world. "Why do you not hate us?" he asked Ellen when she stopped to watch his crew working. "After everything we tried to do to you and your people." Ellen considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Hate is a waste of energy," she finally said, "and farmers cannot afford to waste anything. Not time or resources or the effort it takes to stay angry at someone who has already been defeated." She knelt down and picked up a handful of the dark soil. letting it run through her fingers like water. "This land has been feeding my family for 3 generations," she continued, "and it will feed my grandchildren and their grandchildren long after both of us are forgotten." She stood up and looked at Vorik with eyes that held no anger, but also no mercy. "You came here thinking you would take something from us, but you did not understand what you were trying to take. And that is why you lost." Vorik nodded slowly, beginning to understand something that his military training had never taught him. The humans did not fight like other species because they did not think like other species. Their minds, shaped by 10,000 years of working the land and learning that true victory came not from destroying your enemies, but from outlasting them. Young boy ran through the field toward the governor, his face bright with excitement as he carried a message from the communication center. "Ships are coming," he announced breathlessly. "Big ships from the Alliance with supplies and engineers to help us rebuild." Ellen smiled and ruffled the boy's hair with affection. "Go tell your mother to prepare the guest houses," she instructed him, "and make sure the welcome banners are hung in the town square." The boy ran off to deliver the message, and Ellen watched him go with a look of pride and hoped that Vorik found strangely moving. "He was born 3 years before your invasion," she told the general, "and his mother taught him to shoot a bow before he started school." She turned to face Vorik directly, and her expression grew serious. "Every child on this world learns the same lessons, how to work the land and how to defend it. And they will teach those lessons to their own children when the time comes." She gestured to the fields around them, to the workers rebuilding what had been destroyed, and the new crops already beginning to push through the soil. "This is what you were really fighting against," she said. "Not weapons or technology, but a way of life that has survived everything the universe has thrown at it for 10,000 years. Vorik looked at the humans working around him, saw the determination in their eyes and the strength in their hands, and finally understood why his invasion had been doomed from the very beginning. These were not soft creatures who had retreated from the dangers of the galaxy to hide on a quiet farming world. These were the descendants of the people who had tamed Earth itself, who had turned wilderness into civilization and learned to thrive in every environment from frozen tundras to burning deserts. They had brought those skills to the stars, and they had spent 3 generations preparing a welcome for anyone foolish enough to think they could be easily conquered. Commander Zorath eventually negotiated the release of his fleet and his surviving soldiers, trading technology and territory for the return of his people in a deal that left the Dominion weakened and humiliated. The Velthari would never forget the lesson they had learned on New Kansas, and neither would any other species that had watched the events unfold from the safety of their distant worlds. The humans had proven that they were not to be underestimated, that their simple appearance hid depths of cunning and patience that could turn any invasion into a disaster for the invaders on New Kansas. Life returned to normal with remarkable speed. The fields grew golden with wheat once more. The towns filled with the sounds of children playing and families gathering for meals. And the veterans of the harvest went back to the quiet work of growing food and raising animals. But the training continued in every home and every school. The skills passed down from generation to generation like the most precious inheritance imaginable. And in the soil beneath their feet, the nanomachines waited in patient silence, ready to wake again if any other enemy was foolish enough to think that New Kansas was just an agricultural colony. The humans had a saying that Ellen Marsh liked to quote whenever visitors asked about their victory. "They came expecting sheep," she would say, with a smile that carried the weight of 10,000 years of survival. "They found the shepherds."